Good afternoon and welcome to Interviews Are You Ready? Thank you for joining us on Infopointe, Alphapointe's online educational system. For over 100 years, Alphapointe has been a national leader in the employment and rehabilitation of those with vision loss. Today, we are joined by Employment Services Manager, Jay Robertson. Good afternoon, Jay.
Hello, Jesse, and the audience.
So, a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is designed for accessibility. We will be describing all of the slides for those with vision loss, and for those with low vision, we do have a black background with large yellow text. If you use color inversion software, you may need to turn that off. The key command for that in Zoom text is caps lock C. Across either the top or the bottom of your screen should be a bar with controls. You can raise your hand. There is a chat box where you can share information with us or with other participants. And then there's a question and answer box that says Q&A, kind of looks like speech bubbles. At any time during the webinar, if you have a question, stick that in the question and answer box. We have moderators who will be monitoring the question and answer box, and we'll be able to answer those questions at the end of the webinar. So our objectives for today's webinar: we want to learn how to prepare for an interview, know yourself, know the job functions, and know the company, and then how to present. So without further ado, we will let Jay Robertson take it away.
All right, I appreciate the chance to talk about interviewing, and I will date myself a little bit. The first time I taught job-seeking skills was 1984 to a group of individuals with disabilities who were looking for work. So I'm the Employment Services Manager, and we help individuals with vision loss to go back to work. So as far as how to prepare, there's several different main aspects of this. I had done the previous webinar was on online applications, and hope to have that available at some point in a recorded fashion. But it's similar as when doing the online application. Ultimately, this is matching the candidate's strengths with what the employer's basic needs are, the essential functions of the job. So by the time you get to an interview, you're going to have a resume. Review those skills and in comparison to what the employer has listed on the job announcement. See how those match up. From that, you can also just predict questions and identify responses. So be like going in class in a school, you're preparing for a test, an exam. You don't know what the questions are going to be, but if you're aware of what the main job functions are, you can predict some questions and then go ahead and identify responses. For individuals with vision loss, they might need to have some help from a friend or family or employment service specialist to help record some of those responses. So utilize employment services in a job center. They're in Missouri, there's a job center in every main city that is available for job seekers. However, sometimes the help is not as individualized. So that's why we're available to specifically address the needs of job seekers with vision loss.
And Jay, when you say we're available, you're talking about Alphapointe, correct?
Alphapointe, exactly.
And your team, and I think we'll be getting into that a little bit later in the webinar as to how your team specifically helps job seekers with vision loss. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
So rehearsing and practicing questions and answers, and we're going to be getting into that in shortly about what are some of the typical questions that come up. But you want to be prepared just as if you're giving a speech, that it's going to be coming out naturally. You're not going to have to be searching and pausing and trying to remember what your answers are.
So Jay, when we say know yourself, that was a big one on the objectives. What do you mean by know yourself?
Well, by knowing yourself, you have to, you don't always think regularly about what your positive attributes are. And in fact, sometimes people have a hard time thinking about what are some things I could say about my strengths. And we'll be getting into that in detail shortly. But how does your background relate to the job functions that are announced on the job posting? And you might want to consider also if you've ever done any volunteer work in addition to jobs where you've been on payroll, consider what you did that relates to the job that you're applying for.
And so then, so it sounds like knowing yourself, but when you say know your story, what do you mean by that?
Well, some of the examples I'm going to be giving are from interviews this past year, and what I've found is that over the years, there's those traditional questions like, what are your strengths and do you have any weaknesses? But sometimes the most difficult question is some wide open question. Well, tell us about yourself. Well,
I hate that question in a job interview. It's like, what do you want to know?
exactly. We're not used to starting just from scratch, and how can you describe years of experience? But I like to encourage people think about your work history as a storybook. And if it was a story, how would you break that up into chapters? So for me, in my earlier life, I was a bicycle mechanic and I worked in food service. But then eventually I went to work with vocational rehabilitation and then with some agencies like Alphapointe. So I would just describe that. And again, it's rehearsing it in your mind, practicing it out loud perhaps to where that rolls out. You don't need to take a long time, but take a few minutes to describe how your work history developed.
So then,
And it's also, let me just add, it's okay to share a short chapter on your personal history. So for example, this is mostly about your work, but it's okay to say, well, I'm from Kansas City. I've been married for so many years. I've got one son, and also at some point to talk about your vision loss, and we'll get into that. But mostly about your work history, but it's okay to also share some personal information because then you become a person and a little bit more kind of approachable.
how concerned should people be about sharing what we kind of consider that protected status information? So marital status, having children or wanting to have children in the future. Sometimes you hear about when you're going to a job interview that those could potentially reveal a status that people are not allowed to consider when hiring. So
Good,
how concerned should you be about that?
good question. Employers are usually going to stay away from asking those questions, but that can come up. And if you have some personal information that comes up during the interview that you can offer that maybe you are settled as far as not going to be taking off work to have children, but you can just say that, well, my kids are grown if that's the case, and I really want to continue working and keeping with the company and developing my skills. So there's a balance to sharing personal information, but I guess my main message is it's okay to just share a little bit about who you are.
Okay. So, and then in addition to knowing yourself, you say that we have to know the position in the company, correct?
Right. And you are going to have that job announcement available. In fact, when you're applying for jobs, it's good to see if you can have the printed job description, because after you've applied, that gets pulled off of a website, you won't have that anymore. And so you can have that available to refer back to. But if you know the position, what are the main requirements, then you're going to be prepared in the interview to show how your skills match the essential functions of the job. And as far as knowing the company, sometimes you won't be able to know a lot about the company, but something you can consider doing is maybe you're a customer there. If you're going into a certain retail place or entertainment or food service, whatever, you can say when you're interviewing, well, I've been a customer here for so long. If you are not, it's good to do web research and find out whatever you can about the company. What's their main products and services, and what's their locations, what's their mission. If you can find out if they have a mission statement, that's good to be aware of.
And Jay, I have kind of a quick story about that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I did an internship with a major company in the United States that one of their product lines is movies. And we were in a group interview. It was myself and one other young lady, and they said, what are some of your favorite movies put out by this company? And so I was able to rattle off a list of movies because they're movies I watched since I was a kid. And she said a movie that's commonly mistaken to be one of theirs. And they even gave her a second chance to name a movie from their company, and she kind of doubled down and dug in their heels. I noticed when that was over, I moved on to the next round of interviewing, and she did not.
Is that right? That's a good story there. Yeah, that's a good example of how that can come up. So again, walk into the store. If you get a chance to meet somebody informally when you're shopping someplace, that's a good chance to introduce yourself. Or again, do a web search.
And so, are you a match? I feel like this is almost like online dating.
Right, and again, it gets back to do your skills match what they're looking for? Think about the jobs that you have liked the most. This helps you decide if you really want to accept a job, if you're offered the job. What is it about those jobs that you liked? What's most important to you? Know your job requirements and preferences, meaning you want to be sure and have in your mind what hours you're available to work, what days of the week. Do you like working inside, outside? Do you like working with people, with customers, or would you rather work by yourself? So if you really know what makes you happy on a job, that sure helps out getting a good job match and can help you get the job, because you're going to be coming across as interested and enthusiastic about the job.
So what is at the top of your mountain? What do you mean by this, Jay?
Well, it's what motivates us, and different. We're all different. If the reason to going back to work varies. Is this to be able to take care of yourself or your family, just to be able to pay the bills? That's certainly a big thing. And also to afford some fun. I mean, this is especially helpful on a day when it's you're not feeling ready to go to work. Maybe it's too hot, too cold. It's just you're tired. Think about what you're going to be using those paychecks for. For some people, they want to use their skills. They want to have that kind of a mission to help people. It's to be able to develop as a person, in addition to having some paychecks. There may be some other reasons. And think about what reasons going to make it worthwhile going back to work on days that you may not even feel like it.
And how does knowing this help us in the job interview itself?
Well, again, it gets down to finding that match where you're going to be able to portray yourself as someone who's interested and committed to working there. And that's one of the big things that employers really want to hear at the end of the interview. They want to hear that, having heard about the job, you really want that job. And it helps because you're going to be aware of what makes you tick, what makes you thrive.
So what's the situation?
Well, I'm not sure exactly when these behavioral questions started getting popular, these situations, but they're common in a lot of jobs. And the complexity of a job interview sometimes depends on the complexity of the job and the job requirements, the training needed. But be ready with some kind of situational question. Sometimes it's going to be, how did you handle an unhappy customer? And they're going to ask you to think back and give an example sometimes. So it's helpful to think back on any jobs that you've had when you had an unhappy customer or client or whatever, or maybe an unhappy coworker, but how did you handle that situation? Other times it's going to be asking to describe when did you have a conflict with a coworker or manager, and again, how did you address that? How did you resolve that? Think about specific examples and be ready to explain that. Sometimes they'll ask, well, when did you give an example of when you contributed in a team project? What was it you did? How did that make that organization better? And so as far as, it's good to be ready for traditional questions. What are your strengths? And you don't need to go on and on about strengths, but be sure to have at least several strengths. And think in terms of two different types of strengths. A general strength, general attribute that could apply in any job. So maybe you get along with people. Maybe you could say you're a hard worker. You are detail oriented. You're a quick learner. Those are general things that don't have anything to do with your specific work history, but general attributes. And also think about weaknesses. So if they don't, actually I've found that question doesn't come up very often, but it's good to be ready for it. So think of something you can say as a weakness that can actually be flipped around to being a strength. So I was working with one candidate who's actually truly pretty quiet person. And now, quiet's not bad necessarily. It's important to speak up and ask questions, but she wasn't going to be required to be talking a lot on the job that she was applying for. But talking with her, we decided, well, she could say, well, tend to be kind of quiet at the beginning until I get to know my team and get to know the job. And so that's really not a strong negative. Another one might be, well, I tend to take on a lot. I like working, and sometimes I like to get into a lot of extra projects, and sometimes that gets to be difficult. And then you want to follow up by saying, well, how do you deal with that? Well, what I do is I talk to my supervisor and I make sure I know what the priorities are, and I focus in on those things. So again, it's a weakness, but you can switch it around to being a strength. Salary expectations, it's important if you can avoid stating a specific salary that you want. And a lot of times the exact salary on a Indeed or Simply Hired or various websites, it'll be an estimated amount. It won't be the actual salary. What you can do is to say, well, I'm willing to start at whatever you usually pay someone with my experience and skills, because that gets them to name it, and also gives you a chance to highlight, well, look what I've already been doing. So take that into consideration.
So that dreaded, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
And for that, I encourage job seekers to get in the shoes of the hiring manager that they're talking with, who's had the experience of having people come and go. And it takes time and training to get somebody started. And a lot of times the company has had people, kind of a rotation, people coming in, getting trained, and then leaving. So it's okay to talk about some long-term goals, but the main thing I encourage people to say is that I'm really interested in settling into a business like this, and learning as much as I can, and sending the message that you're going to be there in 5 years. Now, if you have an interest someday in learning about other positions, that's fine, but and being promoted. But again, main focus, I'm committed to your company. I plan on being here.
What do you like in a supervisor? Boy, that sounds like a very loaded question.
Right. It can be challenging, but think back in terms of the supervisors you've really felt like the job went well. what was it about them? Do you like someone a supervisor who takes time with you and shows you kind of step by step how to do things? Do you like, it's good to think in terms of what are they wanting to hear? They want to hear that you're going to be paying attention to what the company needs, and yet you're independent as well. So think about some things, rehearse them, um, be able to say a couple things about what you'd like to have in a supervisor.
Why should we hire you?
And that's another one of those relatively general questions that can be challenging. But you want to be able to come back to, it's a chance to restate some things from earlier questions sometimes, just to say, well, as we've talked about, I've done this particular position. I've got the experience. I feel like I can hit the ground running. I feel like I've got and mention certain specific skills, kind of restate some of those strengths.
So visualize, gain confidence, manifest. I feel like this is almost like a new age mantra I can meditate with.
Well, it's a lot of people have been out of work for a while. It's kind of seems like an uphill struggle, and it is. You haven't worked for a while. That natural confidence, well, yeah, I can do this job, isn't there necessarily. So I encourage people to visualize themselves actually having the job, and think back. It's helpful to actually list and rehearse in your mind different accomplishments you've had over the years. And it could have been back years ago, but visualize yourself doing well in the interview. Visualize yourself doing well on a job, and think back on your strengths. One of the things that studies have shown is that sometimes if you're repeating those things in your mind, and they've actually shown that thinking about your accomplishments and strengths and visualizing success and having that job offered as you're sleepy and ready to fall asleep, that's a time when the mind is especially kind of open to suggestions. And so you're kind of programming yourself, and that can sometimes help build that confidence, and the employer can sense that in an interview. And so it's manifesting is kind of planting a seed, visualizing it, and believing things will happen, which is harder than it sounds. So again, list your positive attributes, write it down on paper, type it out, talk it out. You don't need to write it down or even type it out. Just think things through in your mind about what your attributes are, what are your accomplishments.
So why
And
10 accomplishments? Why that number specifically?
sometimes, and it could be more. I've just challenged people to think in terms of different things that they've done over the years. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be on a job. It could have been some successes on the job. It could have been overcoming some things. Think back on some of the biggest challenges that you've had, and that you got through them. And actually there was an interesting Google study in the last few years that found that some of their strongest employees were those employees that actually had overcome a very difficult situation, had overcome a loss. Something had not been easy, and it's those employees who tended to be the strongest performing. And so our job seekers at one point and still currently have been overcoming challenges. And so that's another thing to include, is what challenges in terms of even vision loss. How did you get through certain situations?
So you've prepared, now it's time to present, right?
Right. So you've got the information in your mind. You want to come across this as kind of perhaps hasn't changed a whole lot over the years, but you want to dress one step up from what you're going to be appearing on a job in terms of clothes. So maybe these days, a lot of places for men, you don't wear a tie on the job once you get hired, but you want to at least wear a tie and a dress shirt for the interview. If it's for more of a corporate type of job, and maybe you're not going to wear a sport coat or suit on a job, you still, if you're going for that level position, you'll want to wear that in the interview.
And
If it's for some jobs where there's a lot of positions that our candidates are applying for, though, in terms of retail and perhaps grocery stores, it's okay to wear some khakis and some dress slacks and a nice shirt. You don't always have to wear a dress or a tie, but be sure don't come in jeans and tennis shoes.
I used to do the hiring for a major company here in the metro, and when we would do our interviews, we had a rubric because we would do large group interviews because we would just have so many applicants, and one of the areas on the rubric was dress code. And we looked at what people wore coming in, and so we, most of our positions, we supplied you with a uniform so you weren't having to provide your own clothes. And it was very casual, shorts and a shirt, but we noted what people wore, and they actually got more points for being in khakis and a polo versus jeans and a t-shirt. And that was just one aspect of the rubric, but to move on, you had to score so many points. So even though we were supplying a uniform, I can say we definitely paid attention to what our applicants wore to the interview, because that to us was an indicator of how seriously they were taking it.
Makes sense.
So get there early, make a practice run. What do you mean by make a practice run?
Well, if say if there's the company is, you could do some kind of a search on your phone or on the computer, figure it's 20 minutes away. That's could be in good traffic. You want to allow plenty of time for unknowns. Maybe there's if you're taking public transportation, paratransit, or the bus, or your car, any of those can be delayed. So you want to have plenty of time. It's better to arrive early. So make a trial run before the day of the interview. Find out how long it takes. And then sometimes you're going to discover that it takes actually what time it takes.
I like this, handshake if any. I don't think we're doing a lot of handshaking right now.
Right, exactly. In other times, before our present public health situation, you would want to be sure and shake hands, offer a handshake, and have a firm handshake. These days, probably not a good idea, but you want to be in charge, introduce yourself. If there's maybe a second person who joins the room, joins the interview, just, I'm Jay, nice to meet you, and be enthusiastic and friendly. Have good eye contact and good posture. You don't want to slump down in your chair. These are things that you're not necessarily aware of unless you're paying attention to them. But eye contact is very important. And when you're talking to somebody, it's a natural inclination to sometimes look away as you're thinking, but try and have as much eye contact as possible. Don't sit there with your legs crossed. Just be comfortable, and of course, no gum. Don't need to be popping bubbles.
And now eye contact can be one of those things that for somebody with total vision loss is more difficult. Is that something that you and your team are able to help people we call it mimicking eye contact, or when they don't have that where they can see it?
Right. Our job candidates who don't have the vision to be able to really truly make eye contact, hearing is usually very acute, and you just look towards the person who's talking, and so you can still kind of face the person who's talking and have them have the impression that you're focusing fully on what they're saying.
And is that something you would suggest that somebody practice with maybe a friend or family member prior to the interview?
Exactly, and that's what we also do in Alphapointe's employment services. And it takes multiple times practicing and more than even just one day. In fact, it's a good idea to practice leading up to the interview, but also to refresh, if possible, the day of, or to, if there's not a chance to practice with somebody, then still use some time to think back on those questions that you identified, possible questions, think about your work story. So yes, definitely a good idea to practice ahead of time.
So speak up, smile, be enthusiastic.
Right. And it's easy in an interview to have kind of a not speak clearly or loudly. And sometimes if someone's nervous, you don't necessarily smile naturally. But if you make kind of a conscious effort to maybe even speak up, if you normally have a quiet tone of voice, think about turning up a volume. If it was on a radio, to turn that up a little notch, and try and remember to smile. And enthusiasm is important. Think about if they're interviewing 30 people for the job, and they've got out of those 30 people, 5 really seem to be enthusiastic, and they can imagine you being one of those 5 talking with their customers and with their work crew, then it's the candidates that are enthusiastic and excited about working there that are more likely to get that offer.
So this is a big one, Jay, that we hear all the time from our clients and from people with any disability who are job seeking is, at what point do you disclose that you have a disability? Because the concern is always in the back of somebody's mind that if they disclose that they have vision loss or another disability, that it could prevent them from being hired, especially in the job market we're currently finding ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. And the question comes up also when you're applying for jobs, because more and more, especially with online applications, that there's that question, do you have a disability? And it does give you a chance. One of the choices is to not say whether you do or you don't. And it probably depends a little bit on the online applications, if whether to even to market or not. But I'd say in an interview, a person with vision loss, it would be a good idea to take devices if you use them. So if you normally use a handheld magnifier, take that with you. Be sure it's charged if it's uh, or has fresh batteries or is charged before you take it in, because then you can pull that out and as needed show, well, this is something I use. If I have something in fine print, I'll just use this. And it's not putting a huge focus on it. It's just explaining how you may use a device. If you would use JAWS or Zoom Text or Fusion, you can describe how that you use those in order to cover different work on the computer. So when you're in person in that interview, it's a good idea to go ahead and describe your level of vision, because it's at that point you want to make you want to address that. Otherwise, they're always going to know, well, how's this person, if I hire them, going to be able to handle this part of the job? You can describe how you've handled it on past jobs and how you've been successful. Yeah.
So when you say explain accommodation, what do we mean by that?
Well, employees are, if they're asking for an accommodation, needing an accommodation, it's important for them to be in the driver's seat. And it's legally that you need to disclose that to an employer if you're going to be getting an accommodation. And by then, hopefully, you'll be thinking about what accommodations might be needed based on your past experience, maybe based on recommendations of rehabilitation and employment staff. So whether it's I'm going to be needing to use my handheld magnifier, I'm going to be needing to use JAWS. What it really helps for me to have some materials in large print, or maybe I'll be using a CCTV. And if you own that device already that you'll be bringing in, let them know. You can educate them on the accommodation that you need, and that has you coming across as an informed, capable candidate who's going to be able to do the job.
And so when we say utilize an employment specialist, what is an employment specialist?
Well, an employment specialist, and there are general employment specialists that work at the career centers, but here at Alphapointe, our employment specialists are knowledgeable of vision loss and different accommodations and products that can be helpful. As this topic applies to whether the candidate will want to have somebody like me or another employment specialist come with them to the job, to the job interview, which we like to do. Not all employers are naturally comfortable with that. In fact, some of the larger organizations are like, well, they might be thinking, why does this person need an employment specialist? We have a very demanding job or skilled job, and we want someone who can work independently. But that's where if you choose to have an employment specialist come with you to the interview, then it would be important to introduce your employment specialist. Well, this is my employment specialist, and they may have some, they're going to be available in case there's any questions on accommodations. That puts you in, again, the driver's seat. You're the one who's inviting the employment specialist. Sometimes that's the chance for somebody like me to come to an interview depends on you being the candidate asking for that. And sometimes it might be just as well for an employment specialist to come with, but to wait in the waiting room and to be available to be called in. So a trained, experienced employment specialist is going to be able to help you review all the questions that may come up in an interview. Make sure your resume, you want to have a printed copy of a resume to take in with you, even though the employer is able to print that off of their computer system. So those are just a number of different purposes of utilizing an employment specialist.
And there's some general tips that you have for job seekers, such as, okay, breathe.
Right. I mean, that sounds a little bit silly, but unconsciously, if we're in a situation that's making us nervous, we start breathing shallowly, and that triggers, that kind of completes a feedback loop of oh, the body and the mind are thinking something's going on here. We're under attack or whatever, fight or flight. But if you remember just to take a deep breath as you're going into the building, maybe if you find yourself kind of getting a little bit flustered or nervous, it doesn't have to be a huge visible breath, but just take a breath and it relaxes the body, and that helps you think a little bit too. Be yourself. I mean, you want to, you don't want to come across as a robot. You want to just be yourself. If you and your personality is not a good match for the job that you're applying for and the employer you're trying to get hired with, then it's not going to be a good match. So don't worry about being somebody that you're not.
So you said it's okay to pause before answering a question.
Right. Say if there's a question that came up and there's nothing that's coming to your mind to say at that point, it's okay to have some silence. Just say, even to say, let me think about that. And what that does, that lets the employer know that you're a thoughtful person, that you're just not rattling something off just to say something. Just know that it's okay to pause or to say, let me think about that one for a minute and regroup and then say what your answer is. It's also okay to ask them to repeat a question. Maybe you only heard part of it. Maybe you don't know exactly what they're getting to with that question. So just say, could you repeat that question? Or I'm not sure what you mean by that question. Could you explain more?
And then they're not the only one asking questions, are they?
True. They're asking most of the questions, but they'll usually ask at the end, do you have any questions for us? And at that point, you want to be prepared, just as knowing your strengths and your weaknesses, your being able to tell your work story. Have some questions ready. So you could say, oh, what's a typical day in this position? Can you describe, I've seen the job description, but tell me what a typical day is. You can ask about their customers and their trends. I mean, if you've done your research through the web site, you're going to have some information. And if you've gone into their store, you'll be able to just comment about, well, what's your highest peak times of the day, or what are the busy seasons? Just to ask them about their business. And it's okay to ask, when will a hiring decision be made? And they'll usually be able to say, well, we're finishing up interviews this week, and we anticipate getting in touch with people the week after that. So those are just a few examples.
You say
So,
prepare for disjointedness. What do you mean by that?
right. Some interviews are very, seem very well organized, but I attended an interview at a fairly large organization, and it seemed like the person in charge of hiring had never interviewed anybody before. He didn't have any eye contact. He barely had any questions to ask, which made it difficult, because at that point we had not prepared, the candidate had not prepared to go ahead and start talking a few minutes about what they had done and to give examples about specific job functions. So, and that particular organization was needing people in quickly, and they were having 15-minute interviews. We didn't know that at the beginning, but all of a sudden the interview was over, and it's like, wow, did we cover things? So short interviews, sometimes they may not ask many questions. So again, that's why it's important to be able to be ready to kind of take charge. And let me tell you a little bit about some of the things that I've done. I've also experienced there being a long distance to get to the interview area, and it's okay. It's was at a grocery store, very great interview team, but had to walk down narrow corridors, past all sorts of merchandise, and finally to a small, very small interview room that felt like almost like a closet. So you can just, there's all sorts of things that may come up, and so you'll want to also, especially individuals who may use a cane, or may have a little difficulty seeing through areas where the lighting isn't very good. You want to have your strategy. Are you going to be bringing an employment specialist or friend or family to get you to the interview room, or are you going to be asking the HR person or the manager to guide you back to the interview room?
And sometimes the interview room isn't very comfortable.
Right. When you're in, and this is with all respect to the businesses, maybe they don't have maybe it's not an office corporate kind of setting, and they're using some room that doubles as a storage room for interviews. Just be ready not to have that throw you off.
Yeah, and so then after the interview, so the interview isn't over when you leave the building, correct?
Correct. At the end of the interview, after they've said, do you have any other questions? You want to fit in just some message to say, well, you know, after hearing more about this job, I really want this job. And I remember years ago interviewing for an administrative assistant, and I had several different qualified candidates. And the one who we ended up hiring said that with enthusiasm and intent, and I believed her, and she worked out well. She said, I want you to know, I really am interested in this job. Ask for a business card. And sometimes they're going to offer that to you as you're interviewing. and sometimes they may not have a business card. But if possible, ask for a business card, because that gives you a chance to connect back with them. You'll know the exact phone number. You usually have an email address for them. And consider sending a thank you note. So if you do have their business card and their email address, these days I don't think it's inappropriate to use the email. Just say, send a short note, and feel free to work with your employment specialist or friend or family member on feedback on what to say. But just to get that message across, I really appreciate the chance to interview, and I am very interested in this position, and I look forward to hearing back from you. And there's old-fashioned thank you cards that are sent through the mail, and those make an impression too. So, but it's a good idea if you can. Not absolutely make or break, but it helps to send a thank you note.
And then Alphapointe can help. So our comprehensive rehab services team can do assessment to help you determine what adaptive skills of blindness you may need to get or to cultivate in order to then re-enter the workforce, and we can provide training to help you gain those skills. And of course, Jay, you have your team that you help people in all. What does your team do during the job search process?
Well, there's kind of a science and an art to shortening the job search by doing things in a certain sequence. And I mentioned some of these things on the previous Infopointe training, is that one of the main things we do is help a person gather the information that's going to be needed for applications early on. We'll want to also, though, give feedback about what are some different job settings, types of businesses that might be of interest. So to get an idea about the number of different places we can help the candidate apply to. But we will help gather that information for what we call a master job application, and that gives all the detailed information, including addresses, phone numbers of employers, wage information. Sometimes these days you can spend 40 minutes on an online application and get hung up when they say, what's the email address of your past work supervisor? We have gathered about all the questions that are imaginable for that. We use that to develop a resume or fine tune it, come up with a couple of different types of resumes. There's the chronological type of resume, which starts listing work history from most recent to further back. There's a functional style resume, which tends to group skill sets at the top and give more detail on that. And very briefly, just list the companies and dates worked for at the bottom. So we'll go over that. We'll talk about cover letters. We'll talk about interviewing skills as we have today. We will help introduce people to employers who seem to be supportive of individuals with vision loss or of other disabilities, and talk about how to do some follow-up over the phone or in person after the application's been made.
And then can you tell us a little bit about what job coaching is?
Sure. And job coaching or job supports is another term. It's whatever support is needed to get started on the job. It's our focus not to just get a person to the job, but to make sure the job's going well. We will take into consideration, we'll be anticipating those accommodations. We'll be helping brainstorm ideas we work with state agency rehabilitation services for the blind, vocational rehabilitation, to identify what's going to be needed on that job. And we'll make sure things are going well on the job once a person starts. So we can come on site. We don't want to get in the way. We can do support off-site, talk with people before and after work about how things are going. Maybe there's an employer that doesn't seem to be easy to work with, or there's some information that's hard to figure out in the way that has been presented.
So that sounds
Maybe.
like something that could be very beneficial. People can talk to their state counselors if they have a case open with the vocational rehab program. I know that we've got about 10 minutes left, and we do want to leave time open for questions. One question we had 2 weeks ago was, any special tips for a phone or video interview? Those are becoming more common right now. So anything that people need to do differently for those?
Well, a lot of the preparation's the same, but for a videoed interview, from experience with a candidate who applied a few months ago, we found that it's very important to have somebody available, a specialist in vision loss, to help you get through the interview, because you want to make sure that the camera's set up, that it's accessible. We found that if the company is offering an accommodation for a person with a disability, it's usually better to say yes and find out what those options are. But sometimes for somebody who used an audio reader like JAWS, some of these virtual interviews are not completely accessible. So that's where we're help be available to support that process.
And if you're going to be on video, having somebody that can kind of help you set up that video, make sure that you are in frame, can be a big one. And then being aware of, we all have sort of little motor tics or fidgets that we have. And as a sighted person, you can often see yourself on the screen and go, oh, I need to sit still. So having somebody that can kind of help coach you on those things that you're maybe not conscious of, that may not play out well on screen.
Exactly, good examples. And my candidate also, it's a very unusual situation when you're talking to a computer, not a live person, because it was tempting just to actually even be looking down, thinking, and that the volume, voice level got lowered, and I encouraged him just to speak up a little bit more. Well, it allows you usually to do a practice sometimes before you start the actual interview, which that was the point where I was picking up that he was being very soft-spoken and he would need to turn that volume up.
So we want to open up to questions and answers from the audience. So while if you have a question, you can type it into that question and answer box. And so while we're waiting for any of those questions, we do want to say thank you for participating in this webinar. Alphapointe exists to empower people with vision loss to achieve their dreams and aspirations. If you would like to help support our mission, please go to www.alphapointe.org, and there is an E on the end of Alphapointe, where you can donate, volunteer, or acquire products or services. And if you have vision loss, or if somebody you know has vision loss and would benefit from our services, you can again contact us at www.alphapointe.org, or you can call 816-421-5848. So the first question is, how soon will this webinar be available to review? We're hoping to have it up on the YouTube channel within about 48 hours once we have a chance to upload it. So you'll need to look at the Alphapointe YouTube channel for the webinar link. Do we have any other questions from the audience today? Well, Jay, I think that you did a wonderful job. Thank you for joining us today. Lots of very good information and very timely information given the state of our economy right now.
It presents an extra challenge. That's why it's so important to have every piece in place leading up through the process, those resumes in good shape and the interview skills developed.
Well, at this time, we will bid everybody farewell, but please don't forget to tune in this Thursday at 2 p.m. for Expanded Core Curriculum at Home Self-Determination, where we'll be joined by Jake McLaughlin and Scott Thornhill to talk about choice-making, advocacy, and problem-solving skills, and how parents can support those with their students who are currently learning at home. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks.